You're a scholar in historical Jesus studies, and you specialize in the evidence surrounding the resurrection of Jesus. What are the facts that scholars, regardless of their theological background, whether they believe in God or not, would agree on most surrounding especially the death and resurrection of Jesus?
Well, I would say nearly 100% are going to agree that Jesus died by crucifixion in the first century, either 30 or 33 AD. You'll have a handful who would deny it, someone like a Barbara Tita of the Jesus Seminar, but I mean, she's really on the fringe of even that group. One of those who would say that Jesus survived crucifixion, he got married to Mary Magdalene and went out of the country and had kids. But nobody really accepts what she's saying on that. You'll have a few scholars who are open to the possibility that Jesus survived crucifixion. But I mean, since 1985, you could count all of these scholars on one hand out of thousands. All right. So I'd say Jesus' death by crucifixion, it's one of the most certain facts of the ancient world. Nobody really, questions this. And good reason why. I've articulated a number of reasons in my large volume on the resurrection. So that'd be one thing. Yeah, Jesus died by crucifixion. There'd be other things such as Jesus came on the scene believing that he had been given authority by God. Now, I'm just giving you minimalistic things that virtually 100% of scholars would agree upon. So that he believed that God gave him authority to help usher in his kingdom, that he taught in parables, that he had followers from both Jews and Gentiles, that he performed deeds that appeared miraculous in nature, that astonished crowds, that he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. Not that they were, even skeptics will account for them by other means, but we at least can be certain that Jesus performed these deeds that astonished crowds, all right? That he was crucified on orders of Pontius Pilate, that he died as a result, and we can know that shortly thereafter, a number of his followers had experiences that persuaded them that Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them. That would be nearly 100%. And then you would have...
So you're talking atheist scholars?
Jewish scholars, liberal, almost everybody. So, yeah. So that's
and that's agreeing that the disciples were convinced that Jesus had appeared to them.
That's correct. Yeah. And again, I'm not basing this argument to say we should believe it because the majority of scholars do. I'm just saying that the evidence, which we haven't mentioned, the evidence for these things is so great, historically speaking. You don't get absolute certainty, but you certainly get reasonable historical certainty. The evidence for it is so strong that it has persuaded scholars from all across the spectrum, like you said, atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, liberal Christian scholars, to agree to these facts I just mentioned.
Now, that's interesting because there is one group that can't possibly agree with some of that, given their theological background. I interact a lot with Muslims, and one of the facts you mentioned, Muslims would be happy to grant that Jesus was known as a miracle worker. He's also known as a miracle worker in the Quran. So Christians and Muslims would be happy to agree on that point. But two of the points, that Jesus died on the cross and that he appeared to his followers later, at least that they were convinced, Islam's going to have much more problem with that. Now, on the first point, that Jesus died by crucifixion, Muslims can grant that, yes, all the evidence supports Jesus dying by crucifixion, but it's because Allah disguised someone to make him look like Jesus. And of course, so lots of people thought they saw Jesus die by crucifixion. That's why we have so many sources reporting that this was the belief of the ancient world, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Do you see any problems with that kind of view?
Well, I'm coming at it from a historical viewpoint, not one of faith on this. Now, that's not to say I don't have faith. It doesn't matter what your worldview is, you have faith. But we have really, really good historical evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. The only evidence we have against it really would be the Quran, which was written 600 years after Jesus, and the spurious Gospel of Barnabas, which, because of numerous reasons, it contradicts the Quran. It contains numerous anachronisms in it. It's been shown to be a 14th or 15th century Muslim forgery. I mean, it's the same thing as like what the Gospel of Peter would be to Christians, But this thing even contradicts the Quran, so you can't really trust the Gospel of Barnabas. And again, the Quran was written 600 years after Jesus. That's the only thing that would really tell us that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, and it's a faith book. So, I mean, that's one major, from the viewpoint of a historian, it's very implausible to believe the Quran on this. But there are theological reasons as well, and the one I give, I call the Islamic catch-22. We can show historically, I could give numerous historical arguments to suggest to us that Jesus indeed predicted his imminent death, imminent violent death, and subsequent resurrection. Now, and an increasing number of scholars, historians of Jesus, are agreeing to this. I mean, the evidence is there. So here's the thing. Muslims and Christians believe Jesus was a great prophet. So since Jesus predicted his imminent death, if Jesus did not die an imminent death, that makes him a false prophet. So therefore the Quran is wrong because it says he's a great prophet. But on the other hand, if Jesus did die an imminent death, well, then the Quran is still wrong because in Surah 4, it says he didn't. Either way, the Quran is mistaken on the matter.
And it's just really weird to say all of our historical evidence supports this, but God just tricked everyone into believing that. If you can do that, you could do that with anything, right? You could say, hey, you don't want to believe Columbus ever sailed to the New World? Maybe God tricked everyone into believing that. You could explain anything historically like that. People who believe that Neil Armstrong walking on the moon was a hoax. Well, maybe God did that hoax, right? And then how do you ever disprove it? So really, really confusing. But at least Muslims can say that they have an explanation for Jesus' death by crucifixion. God tricked people into believing it, but there's this additional historical fact that the disciples believed he was appearing to them. And I wonder, how do you account for that? And it seems you'd have to say something like God allowed Jesus to appear to them, or you'd have to have Jesus' twin came and appeared to them. You'd have to have some additional really odd theory. And so in order to make that consistent with Islam, to make Islam somehow compatible with the historical evidence. So at the end of the day, we have all of the evidence and we're trying to make a coherent picture of the evidence. If Jesus is a miracle worker, he predicts his death, he dies by crucifixion, and he appears later, at least his followers are claiming. Well, the Christian view really takes all of that into account and does so, as you say, without strain. Whereas Islam, we've got Jesus living the most miraculous life in history, but then God's going to trick people into believing that he died for crucifixion when he really didn't. God took him to paradise, and then God somehow let Jesus appear to his followers to comfort them or something, but then they completely misinterpret it and think that he's the risen Lord. And this is just, how much respect do you have for God if you're using God in this way to explain away evidence that we have? What are your final thoughts on this?
Well, as I've heard you say in it, I think you're absolutely right on it. In that case, given the Islamic view, then that makes God a deceiver. And you can understand why he would deceive, the people who wanted to kill Jesus. But why would he deceive his followers, who the Quran calls Muslims, the original apostles? So why would he allow them to be deceived by God without correcting it, and then become the largest religion in the world and Islam's greatest competitor? It seems that wouldn't be wise of God to do that. And then the Muslim would have to ask himself, well, if he's going to do that in the case of Jesus' disciples, who the Quran calls Muslims, how do present-day Muslims know that God isn't deceiving them? I've heard you say this, and I think that's a legitimate argument. So not only would this make God out to be a deceiver whom Muslims can't trust, it also makes Jesus to be a false prophet and contradicts the Quran. So it's very problematic to say that Jesus didn't die on the cross.
And it's just interesting that regardless of how you're going to reject the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, you either end up having to come up with extremely odd theories about mass hallucinations among many people, or you end up with these kind of theological problems of God deceiving and tricking in people. And once you introduce an omnipotent deceiver into your equation, who knows what to believe? And it's no coincidence that Muhammad's closest companion, Abu Bakr, said, if he had one foot in paradise, he would still fear Allah's deception. That's the impact of this kind of theology. All right, well, thank you, Mike, for your input. And again, ladies and gentlemen, this is not me talking. This is a historical Jesus scholar and my Muslim friends out there, you need to rethink your theology.